My name is Ed Salo. I have a PhD in history, and I'm currently an associate professor of history at Arkansas State University. And I kind of gained my knowledge of Chernobyl through being around when it happened and being kind of a political science history nerd. Recently, in the past year, I've been working with the New America think tank looking at problems of nuclear security. And one of them was looking at what do you do when you have a armed conflict and it's being fought around nuclear reactors that are, we think about all the problems of nuclear weapons, but not what to do in these kind of things. So that's what I've been kind of researching with them for the past year or so. I was like an eighth grader and it was a really scary time because, we were brought up really be afraid of nuclear power. It was a horrific accident. And at the time, we were just thinking it was just going to be like a big radioactive crater. There was things like the core was going to melt through the thing and go into the earth and pollute water. It was just like people didn't know. And, today we have social media where all these conspiracies get around. But, at this time, there still were conspiracies or, I wouldn't say misinformation, just like all these scenarios out there. They weren't really sure. So, yeah, it was a scary time. Even though we were just a couple of years from the wall falling, 1986, people didn't realize that. And still was this time of fear. And no one was trusting what the information was coming out was. And yes, they were also trying to cover it up and make it not into, as big a disaster emergency as it was, but nobody was trusting anything they were saying. And you were getting talks of readings of radiation in Europe. It was a really scary time. After it was determined that it wasn't going to, the core wasn't going to melt and go into the earth and all that, there still was this whole fear of the radiation exposure, fears of like, oh, it's going to get in the eggs, it's going to get in the cows, it's going to, the milk's going to be radiated, mother's milks are going to be radiated. We're going to have people who are going to have higher levels of cancer because of all of this. And then, all the thoughts of like, well, are we going to have to kill a bunch of animals because they're radiated, or all these kind of things, because you didn't really know what was going to happen. And then, of course, the accident was partly operator error and partly machine error. Then you start thinking, well, how many reactors do they have? So are we sitting on that many time bombs? Is this going to happen everywhere? A real big black eye for the Soviet Union because, Cold War, one of the gauges of how good a country was technology. Going back to the space race where, the Soviets were the first ones in orbit, the first ones with a satellite, first man in orbit, first woman, all these wins. Soviets were proud of their nuclear reactors. It was something that they could show to developing nations that we have this technology and we can help you get electricity and all this kind of stuff. And then it's like, boom, your stuff is dangerous. You have this huge accident, and then Ukraine, where this is kind of the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It was where a lot of the grain was grown that they used to feed the population. So there was a big fear of, okay, is this going to irradiate where we grow our food? It's been one of those things that has made people more hesitant to use it as a clean energy source as compared to fossil fuels. People still kind of use it as the catch-all for a disaster at Chernobyl. So I think that it's really slowed the development of reactors as a way to get power. It was a total embarrassment for the Soviet Union. You could argue that it was part of one of the things that kind of continued the downward decline of the Soviet Union to its fall because people lost more trust in the government and the human costs, losing the reactor, the area. I think that if it hadn't been for Chernobyl, there's a good chance that we would be using a lot more nuclear power. That's one of the double-edged swords with nuclear power is it's always the fear of what it can do and what people can twist it to do to make weapons. But still, there is always that fear that, okay, someone's going to put in a plant for energy. Well, someone could also use it to develop weapons. Which, yeah, but probably most people are going to just use it for the power. I think, unfortunately, we kind of forget the details of disasters. The name still Chernobyl equates to a disaster, and it doesn't even have to be a nuclear disaster. It's sort of just like a catch-all for any kind of disaster. We've kind of forgotten a lot of the basic lessons, but in the back of our mind, yeah, I think it's stopped people from really trusting nuclear energy. So I think that's kind of hurt. And it can be used by both sides. It can be people saying it's a dangerous form of energy, and that can be done by environmentalists, and it can be done by people who are promoting a different form of energy. It's one of those things. If you're touting solar panels or something, or continued use of fossil fuels, and someone's like, well, we could do this. I'm like, well, what about Chernobyl? And then, of course, Chernobyl, yeah, it was a big environmental disaster as well as a human disaster. So, I mean, yeah, there are horrors that we need to pay attention that could happen other places. Everyone can kind of use it for their political goals.